Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cleveland Clinic's CEO and President, Dr. Toby Cosgrove.
Well, welcome to the first of our 2009 Ideas for Tomorrow speaker series. I'm delighted to welcome Glenn Lowry to be with us today. Glenn is an author, teacher, a respected scholar of Islamic art and architecture. He is also the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. As the sixth director of MoMA, Mr. Lowry brought a new vision and entrepreneurial spirit to the 75-year-old museum. Under his leadership, MoMA has been reborn as one of the world's most powerful and best-run cultural institutions. Glenn Lowry was born in New York City and grew up in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Not too surprisingly, he attended Williams College, determined to become a downhill skier and a doctor. His desire to have classes only on Tuesday through Thursday in the afternoon, however, led him to an art history course that set him on a path to his true career. He graduated magna cum laude in art history. Specializing in Near Eastern art, he earned his master's and doctorate from Harvard and worked as assistant curator at the Fogg Museum at Harvard. He was named director of the Muscaril Museum of Art in Williamsburg in 1982, curator of Near Eastern art at the Smithsonian Sackler and Freer Gallery in 1984. From 1990 to 1995, he was director of the Art Gallery of Ontario, one of Canada's most important museums. He became director of MoMA in 1995 at the age of 41. His first job was to raise $900 million to fund the largest expansion and renovation in the museum's history. He hired architect Taniguchi to virtually remake and rebuild the entire exhibition and space. This incredibly complex task involved closing the museum, moving the collection into storage into the temporary display area in Brooklyn. The former director of the Whitney Museum of Modern Art called the expansion probably the biggest project of our lifetime, which Glenn Lowry pulled off with aplomb. Indeed, Mr. Lowry finished the project to critical acclaim in time for the museum's 71st anniversary. Since then, he made MoMA into a champion of contemporary and modern art. He expanded hours, increased the membership by 150%, and has generally been acclaimed as one of the great leaders in art and culture in the world. Let's take a look at a brief video that describes his vision and that of the mission of MoMA.
I'm basically an optimist. I look out at the world and I think that if you do something really well, and if you do it in a way that it engages and embraces a public that artists feel is central to the way they have to live, people will ultimately cherish what you do and want to sustain it. If you think of the museum as a forum where ideas can meet works of art and can create unique experiences, then you have a place that has the kind of traction that's really important. It's to be the kind of place that stimulates intellectual and artistic inquiry, that is as much a home to artists as it is to the general public. We are always about the future. We're prospective. Our whole goal has been to have a context for understanding the most recent works of art and the ideas of artists working today. Acquisitions are, of course, one of the most exciting things we do, and what we have is a remarkable curatorial staff, something like 50 men and women, who spend their life thinking about, talking about, and looking at art. Oh, the discussions about what to buy can be incredibly intense. And I think that's terrific. It's because both the curators and the members of the committee feel so deeply and strongly about artists and individual works of art. So you can go for months without a really heated debate, and then suddenly there'll be a work of art that just touches a button, gets people really excited, or perhaps gets them really angry and upset. And I actually think the best discussions we've had have been about the most contentious works of art, where the jury is out. Should we take a risk on this artist? Should we take a risk on this specific work of art or not? The goal is always to have a kind of balanced program. Different media, architecture, photography, painting and sculpture shows, but also exhibitions that deal with big, broad themes, as well as small, really focused ideas, exhibitions that tackle new subjects, as well as exhibitions that deal with more familiar ideas in an unfamiliar way. And I think it's the mix, again, that is what's essential. One of the great things about Yoshio Taniguchi's design for the Museum of Modern Art is he's given us a platform that we never had before to regain the idea of the museum as a laboratory, a physical space in which ideas can be played out, where artists who are pushing the envelope are as much at home as an artist like Matisse or Picasso. And that's a very difficult thing to do. If we want to stay modern, if we want to stay current and with the moment, it's not going to be by looking at what a generation in their 50s or 60s or 70s thinks is important. It's going to be by being a space that can embrace the ideas of younger generations. We hope that we're like an incubator of ideas, that we provide something unique and extraordinary, the opportunity to see, experience, engage with some of the most important works of art ever created, but also with the ideas those works of art generate. And those ideas are not limited to a physical space.
Please welcome Dr. Glenn Lowry.
Thank you so much, Toby. What a great pleasure it is to be here. I have to say that I spent a truly amazing afternoon thanks to Toby and the remarkable staff of the clinic, wandering around in the back rooms and taking a peek at an operating room and beginning to understand what an extraordinary achievement you have created here. I used to think that the Museum of Modern Art and its expansion was a fairly large, complex enterprise. I have been humbled. And I'm also just thrilled to be here because what I really want to talk about is something that I hope will spark a discussion with all of you. And when Toby asked me if I would speak tonight, he suggested that I address the question of artistic creativity. A topic that, in fact, could probably keep us here for the next decade without exhausting all of the possibilities, but one that is absolutely central to what we do. So I decided to use this issue as a means of thinking about the relationship of museums, and especially museums of modern art, to the creation of art. That is, what role can a museum play in the making of art? And how does that affect, ultimately, the life of that institution? That is, the museum as catalyst, as incubator, as laboratory, but also as patron. To try and get at this issue, what I want to do is first make some general observations and then look more closely at several recent initiatives at the Museum of Modern Art, and then end by examining in some detail the creation and realization of a very particular and singular work of art, Pipilotti Wrist's Pour Your Body Out, 7,354 cubic meters, which happens to be the volume of our central atrium. So let me begin with a few quick observations about museums in general. Most of us tend to think that an art museum is first and foremost a repository, a place where treasured objects are held in trust for a public. But all museums, I would argue, regardless of their subject, are really ultimately about ideas rather than specific objects. This is true whether one is talking about universal museums like the Great British Museum, or monographic museums like the Warhol Foundation, or even thematic ones like the Museum of Modern Art. Each is grounded in a particular idea or set of ideas that is then manifested through a discrete set of objects that are believed to reflect those ideas. So in the case of the British Museum, it's the notion that scientific inquiry into the breadth of human creativity can lead to a deeper understanding of the human spirit, and that art can be classified in the same way that species can be organized into taxonomies. While in the case of the Warhol Foundation, it's the belief that Andy Warhol was a singular genius whose achievement can best be grasped through a concentrated examination of his work. The point I want to make is that seen in this way, art museums are not just venues of aesthetic engagement, but also places of intellectual, social, and cultural engagement. That is, they are places where people come to see and think about art with other people. And the result of this is the creation of shared values and shared experiences that, taken in the largest sense, is how we make culture. Now, the Museum of Modern Art set out to be a very different kind of museum from its predecessors. It did so by necessity because when it was founded in 1929, there were no pre-existing models. The idea behind the nascent museum was actually a very simple one, that modern art, that is what we would call today contemporary art, art of our time, is every bit as engaging, important, and meaningful as the art of the past. And the museum took as its mission to make this art intelligible and central to the way we live our lives and think about art. Let's look at how Alfred Barr, the founder of the museum, first diagrammed his ideas about modern art. This is the cover of a book of his called Cubism and Abstract Expressionism, and as you can see, he was trying to take all of these different ideas, Cubism, Fauvism, Post-Impressionism, modern architecture, and make order out of them. Now, you don't have to look too carefully to realize it was a Herculean task, and we're still trying to do this. But that is the founding idea of our museum, to try and make this intelligible. It's a blurry slide, but you'll get the point. Barr ultimately recognized that the museum and modern art were like a torpedo moving through time, with the nose the ever-advancing future and the tail the ever-receding past. And that model of an institution that has 1 foot in the future and 1 foot in the immediate past is the grounding experience of the Museum of Modern Art. When we were founded in 1929 in November, that is 1 month after the Great Depression, we were founded in rented office space in the Heckscher building, which is the building to your left next to the Plaza Hotel. 4,000 square feet of office space. No one had a clue whether this was just going to be a good idea or whether it was going to die on the vine within months. As it turned out, despite the horrible economic climate, the Museum of Modern Art took off By 1932, 3 years after its founding, the Rockefeller family gave to the museum a small brownstone house at 11 West 53rd Street, the locus now of the museum. We've never changed our address, although we've expanded and grown. But what happened when the family gave us this house was that we moved from being a dream to being a reality, to having a permanent home, to being a place now where people would come to look at art, think about art, and ultimately to have a permanent collection, a group of objects that could reflect that founding idea of the institution. By 1939, that is really 7 years after our move to 53rd Street, we created our first custom-built building. And this is a very important point of departure, because when the founders of the museum set out to make manifest this idea, not just with objects, but in stone and concrete, they had to find a way of expressing that. And they did it in two very important ways. The first was to borrow the language of international modernist architecture, to set the museum apart from its predecessors that had used the language of neoclassical architecture, to elevate the museum and to address the museum's relationship to a perceived antique past, to associate the institution with classical ideas and classical learning. But the founders of the Museum of Modern Art said, that's the past, we have to be about the future. The second thing they did was to disengage the museum from the steps and parks that had become the typical locus for museums in America. Think of the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art with its great steps rising off of Fifth Avenue, or even your extraordinarily beautiful building here, your 1916 building, set in a park, but disengaged from the street. Not only by the park, but by that flight of steps, and then a building that essentially was a box inside of which activity occurred. When the Museum of Modern Art adopted a different model, it moved away from this idea of the museum as a place for classifying and articulating and examining the past, to being a place that was part of the street, that would take its energy from the activity of the street, and that wouldn't see a distinction between looking at art, going to work, coming home, and simply living. We became a machine for modern living. So when we rebuilt our campus at the end of the 20th century, we opened to the public in 2004, one of the remits to Yoshio Taniguchi was to create a building that would be porous and open to the city, that would actually allow the museum to explode out into the fabric of New York's dense urban environment, but that could also take the energy of New York and lock it in to the activities of the museum. So here you see a view from one of our galleries looking out over our garden, across to our education and research building, but the frame is the street of New York and all of its energy and activity. Or if you're in the central atrium and you look up, you not only look up to the skylight, but you look up to the apartment tower that soars above the museum. It's as if every dimension of the city's life becomes a critical element of the experience of the museum. And in doing that, it transforms the way we think about and understand art. And that porosity, that openness, gave way to a suite of galleries that always have multiple entrances and multiple exits, because the museum wanted to move away from a linearly directed, what some of our curators called monovectral. I had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what that meant. But a museum where you went in one door and you just kept moving in the same direction until you exited. We wanted to create a place that you would discover, where we would put forward some ideas and some possible comparisons, but that actually, as you move through the museum, you would make it up on your own. In other words, to vest in our visitor the confidence that he or she could make order out of the art on display. And of course, for me, the most exhilarating aspect of this new institution was the way Taniguchi exploded the galleries out into the city. So that if you're coming down Fifth Avenue, that great boulevard in New York, what you do is you look right into the heart of the museum. You look into the galleries, you look into the people looking at art, so that the experience of the museum as a source of energy, as a source of ideas, as a locus of artistic experience, becomes an integral part of Manhattan itself. It's as if we were a kind of little nuclear reactor located in the middle of Midtown that could generate heat by the very nature of the experience of looking at art. Now, at roughly the same moment that we were completing this project, we felt it was essential to foreground the museum in the present, in contemporary art, the art that's being made right now by artists whose names we've never heard of. And we decided to merge with PS1, a contemporary art center in Queens, just across the river from us, a place that is dedicated to artists. That's all they do. They don't have a large public. We might have 3 million people visit a year. PS1 might have 100,000 people visit a year, but they're all artists. And we wanted to get to know the relationship that PS1 had created with its artists, because what we wanted from that, in addition to simply having more space to do contemporary art, was to understand the way artists can connect to the next generation and lock that generation into our future. So here you see a typical afternoon at PS1, usually something on the order of 3,000 to 5,000 people, mostly in their late teens and 20s, coming out to look at art. You see in the background Bell and Ball's Summer Pavilion. Every year we commission a different architect to design a pavilion for the courtyard. What you see here is a demographic that's fundamentally different than most major art museums have. We said, if we can learn how PS1 does this, if we can make PS1 part of our lifeblood, then we can find a way to make that audience with its interests, its ideas, part of the Museum of Modern Art. And this is what happened. We started having happenings. We asked the curators at PS1 to come and work with us at the Museum of Modern Art. The first thing they did is they asked Doug Aiken, young artist from California, if he would do a sound happening for us. Here you see about 2,000 people in our atrium getting ready for Doug to perform on his soundboard. And we do this now virtually every Friday, not to mention other days of the week. And this audience is our future, but now they're not simply located across the river, they're now part of us. And Doug then went on to do the next step in our evolution into a different kind of museum. Again, a page out of PS1, to take the exterior of the museum, the public space of the museum, and say, how can we make this a work of art? How can we take every corner, every nook, every cranny of the museum and activate it by art, making art the catalyst of the museum? So Doug said, let me do a project where I'll turn the exterior of your museum into a multiplex. He created something called Sleepwalkers, which tells the story of 5 different New Yorkers in a very almost hypnotic way. And you see Tilda Swinton on the far left, and Cat Powers, a kind of cult musician, in the center screen. Or my favorite, Donald Sutherland, here, who played the role of a businessman. And suddenly, not only had we exploded the museum out of its walls, we had taken the art onto the face of the museum, and we had transformed our garden, which at night is dead, into a movie theater that every night brought 2,000 to 3,000, mostly kids, but they were from every walk of life, people just walking down the street going, what's that on the wall? Why is Donald Sutherland there? My favorite story about Donald Sutherland is that We asked him if he would play a role in this film. It involved him being a kind of tycoon in a taxi, and at a certain moment, he has to get out of the taxi, and he's so happy that he jumps up onto the hood of the taxi and he tap dances. Now, Donald Sutherland is very tall and in his mid-70s. So we had a body double for him to do the tap dancing. And he got up, he jumped on the hood, and we said, okay, Mr. Sutherland, Bob is ready to come in. And he said, what are you talking about? And he proceeded to tap dance. And I don't believe he ever intended to do that. I think he was moved, like everybody else was, by being engaged in a process that was all about the unexpected. Now, to segue very directly into the issue of artistic creativity in the museum. Creativity, a number of people have observed, is really about problem solving. We all actually are creative because we're all faced with questions and issues that have answers we don't know. And the brilliant artists are the ones who can find the biggest problems and come up with the most innovative and unexpected solutions. And so we started to think about how can we really get this dynamic between artists and the museum going. And we realized we have a number of public spaces. Here is the Gund lobby, named after Agnes Gund, who will proudly tell you she is from Cleveland, which is one of the most beautiful spaces in the museum that looks out onto our garden and where Rodin's great Balzac is located. And a number of us started to feel that there was something odd about this space, that for all of its beauty, it was a pass-through space. People didn't stop and look. No matter how many benches we put down, it was a kind of thoroughfare. And more importantly, rather than breaking down the barriers between the museum and the street and allowing people to become more relaxed before they got directly into the galleries, it had a kind of formal rigidity to it that we found difficult. So we started to ask artists, what would you do with this space? Do you have any ideas? How could we transform this? And a young Scottish artist named Jim Lambie said, well, I make these Zobops, these kind of psychedelic colored installations that can go anywhere. And I think if you put a Zobop down on that space, you'll be surprised what happens. So this is what happens when you put a Zobop down. First of all, that the harshness of the space disappears into this multicolored pattern of striped lines that take their movement from their bumping into objects. So you can begin to see around the big column how the Zobop lines start to create a ripple like water when a stone drops into it. But most importantly, look at what's already happening. People are taking pictures of themselves in the mid-center behind Balzac. They're sitting down on the floor. They're actually beginning to relate to the work of art. That what Lambie understood was that simply by changing the color and texture of that space, by introducing another plane, he would alter the way we actually behave in that space. And I love this image where you can just see people now feel comfortable enough to just sit down, read their map, have a conversation. These images, by the way, I pulled most of them from Flickr, that site where anybody can post their photograph. It's actually fascinating. If you've never been on Flickr, you really should try it, especially if you're involved in an institution like ours that imagines it understands how people look at art. This is how people actually look at art, and it was incredibly liberating to discover the way in which this one work of art had altered this very difficult space. Now, the center of our museum, our atrium, when we originally installed it, had the great Barnett Newman broken obelisk in the center, a couple of paintings, including Monet's Water Lilies, on the walls, and a number of critics rightly observed that it was a big space and it was a cold space, and the water lilies really were diminished by the scale of the space. And one of the things we hadn't understood when we built the space is that you wouldn't only see the painting from the floor, but there are balconies all around it as you circulate, and you'd start to look down as we are here. And so the water lilies, which were meant to be a kind of total field of vision, started to stretch out as if they were a Band-Aid. So you listen to your critics, although it's painful, and you try and say, okay, what are we going to do about that? And the answer we came up with, again, was let's talk to artists. Let's see what an artist would do with this space. Let's make this the most exciting space in the museum. Let's take our problem space and let artists transform it. So we invited Martin Purier, one of the great living sculptors, an African-American artist, to do his own installation in the space while we had an exhibition of his on view. Now, Martin takes mostly wood objects, and he uses his own hands to hew the wood, to make that wood do different things. It's a way of recalling the toil and labor of his forebears who were slaves. It's also a way of honoring craftsmanship, the individual hand. But for our space, he torqued it up. He created this ladder, which is like a ladder to heaven, which is a 60-foot ladder. He built Adastra, which is this wonderful object with these two wheels and this long branch. It's actually 6 tree trunks carefully hewn and spliced together that not only went up to the top of the atrium, but there's a walkway in the upper right, and it goes right up through there. And what he did was he took this, let's see if we can get it to do this. There we go. He took this space with its formality and its kind of massiveness and its rigidity, and he turned it into something febrile and fragile, haunting and mysterious. Suddenly, this was entering a different world. And by doing that, he simply altered that space so that nobody even recognized it. Now, the next move was to invite Olafur Eliasson, a young Danish artist, and who was having an exhibition at the museum. And we said to Olafur, if you could have any space other than the galleries, what would you take? He said, I'd take the atrium. I said, well, what would you do with it? He said, well, I'll put Ventilator in the atrium. I said, Ventilator? What's Ventilator? Well, Ventilator is a normally $49 fan that you can buy in any hardware store, except it's extended on a 60-foot cable, and it zooms around at 81 inches above the ground. 81 inches above the ground. So when it passes overhead, you are extremely aware of it. In fact, one of my trustees, who is 6'7", ducked. And I said to him, this atrium is named in your honor, Don. We are not going to kill you here, I promise. But you'll see in a moment. This is a Flickr image again of what it's like to be in that space with Ventilator moving. The point here is this giant volume, 7,354 cubic meters. You got to multiply that by 10, right, to understand what it is in feet, cubic feet. No, you have to multiply it by 27 to get cubic feet, sorry, is enormous. And this tiny little fan, holds that whole space. I would never have thought of that. I had the giggles when he said that. I mean, how could one small object take over one enormous space? He understood that it was actually the enormity of the space that empowered the ventilator. But what it really did, and this was the unexpected part, is it turned that space, which is austere, which is at the heart of the museum, which is a formal space. You saw even with Martin Purier's installation that it is a very almost sacred space. And he made it into a space where you jump for joy. This is another Flickr image. And all I can say is when I think about the experience of visiting a museum of modern art, that's what I want. Some small child, all on his own, taking off, discovering the sheer pleasure of trying to figure out, why is this fan moving? That's what Olafur did for us. Dan Perjovsky, a Romanian artist, was subsequently invited to work in the atrium. And Dan is a kind of post-communist belles-lettrist. He uses comic ideas to get at serious and important issues, but he's also a performance artist. So what he did was to invite the public to watch him as he basically wrote a diary about being in New York City. And it's a fantastic thing. We had no idea where it was going to go. He just said, I'll work in the atrium. Went up the wall, then you can see it turned right and went along the side of the wall. And he just simply included his little bon mots about what it was like to be a Romanian in New York, thinking about the 20th century or the first years of the 21st century. And it became a kind of focal point of people's visit to the museum. They would spend hours trying to decode these funny little witticisms that Dan had come up with. But now I want to turn to Pipilotti Wrist, that one work of art that I mentioned, by an artist, Pipilotti Wrist, who is Swiss, in her early 40s, and who we invited, actually even before we opened the museum, to do an installation for us, anywhere she wanted. And you see here, self-portrait in a lava bath. It's actually a little video of hers. It's about this size of a quarter, cut into a floor, actually at PS1. And you don't even know it's there except there's a little bit of sound, help me, as you're walking by. And suddenly you look down, and there she is floating in a lava bath. So I thought she might do something like that at the Museum of Modern Art. And her first proposal was to do a few little things like that in our restrooms for our opening. I thought, I don't know. I said, you've done the little thing, but maybe we could do something bigger and different and more exciting. And she said, okay, let me think about that. And she came back with a proposal that blew our mind. So I'm going to set that up for you. But in doing so, let me read you a couple of quotes, because I think they help understand the creative process. Barry Panter is an associate professor of psychiatry at UCLA. He writes, the material artists use for their art comes from the primitive levels of their inner lives: aggression, sexual fantasy, polymorphous sexuality. I don't know what that is, but somebody here can explain that to me. As we mature and are civilized, we suppress these drives. But the artist stays in touch with and struggles to understand them. And to remain so in touch with that primitive self is to be on the fine line between sanity and madness. And interestingly, when you read artists who are very thoughtful about their own work, they often talk about that fine line. Jean Dubuffet, the great French modernist, wrote, "For me, insanity is supersanity. The normal is psychotic. Normal means lack of imagination, lack of creativity." So we have been at the museum assiduously collecting Pipilotti's work. We obviously, through PS1, own Self-Image in a Lava Bath, but her probably best known work, at least up until what she did for us, is a multi-channel video called Ever Is All Over. It premiered at the Venice Biennial just about a decade ago to utter acclaim. It was one of those wondrous moments. It's a video, and you'll see a clip of it in a minute, that basically follows the path of a young woman as she's walking down a street in Zurich. Notice the policewoman in the background. That video, when it was first played, was utterly transfixing and riveting. Why? First of all, it turns upside down all of the normal social forms of behavior you can imagine. This woman, elegant, prancing down the street with a flower that becomes destructive. The cop that comes close to her and turns and smiles to her and acknowledges the freedom of her gesture. The almost orgasmic explosion of those windows as they pop open. This work of art was about a kind of feminist dialogue that looked at traditional modes of behavior and turned them upside down and made them liberating. And of course, if you think of the Swiss, who have a tendency to be a little rigid and uptight, this just rips that one apart and puts it back together in a very different way. So when we were talking to Pipilotti, we said, Ever Is All Over is pretty good. That's what we were thinking about. We didn't need little videos in the bathroom. I mean, we think about something that could be even better than Ever Is All Over. So she came back. We had hoped this would be ready for our opening in 2004. She came back a year ago and she said, okay, you want me to think big. I want the atrium. Give me the atrium. Okay, you have the atrium. What are you going to do? She said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but it's going to be called Pour Your Body Out. I want to do something that allows people to have a absolutely ecstatic experience at the Museum of Modern Art. I want to change the Museum of Modern Art forever. So she came back with this little diagram of what this might look like. There'd be video images on the walls. There'd be these projectors that are hidden up. It's what you see in the upper left-hand corner in sort of like birds' nests. And we said, okay, Pipilotti, but what's this going to be about? I mean, what are we going to be showing? It's going to be about nature and birth and regeneration. I said, okay, well, how's it going to really work? And this was actually kind of interesting because what really impressed me today when I had the privilege of being for a few moments in an open heart surgery operating room was the kind of methodical systems that were in place, the way every move had been thought through and clearly rehearsed, and where a whole team of people had to work in unison. And in many ways, of course, artistic creativity is the antithesis of that. It's about this moment of suddenly understanding a problem, the gesture on the canvas, the kind of spontaneous event. But actually, artists are also highly disciplined individuals who know how to take those ideas, those moments of spontaneity, and translate them into carefully constructed plans that can be realized. So Pipilotti started to take this problem and look at how she could locate it in the building, how it would be realized. And I want to show you one of the things that she quickly understood, that in the middle of this space was a column, and that obviously if you project onto that column, you'll either create a shadow behind the column or you'll create two planes of projection. And she started to try and understand how could she avoid doing that. The calibration of these images that are 24 feet high and almost 370 linear feet long became incredibly complicated. And so she had to really work her way through this. Now, in doing so, she also had to figure out a kind of idea. She had to think about the atrium differently. And I want to just read this quote because it made me think a lot about what she tried to achieve. And it's from Andrea Dworkin, a very well-known feminist theorist, who writes, "Feminist art is not some tiny creek running off the great river of real art. It's not some crack in an otherwise flawless stone. It is, quite spectacularly, I think, art which is not based on the subjugation of one half of the species." Okay, enough of her rhetoric. It is art which will take the great human themes, love, death, heroism, suffering, history itself, and render them fully human. It may also, though perhaps our imaginations are so mutilated now that we are incapable even of the ambition, introduce a new theme, one as great and as rich as those others. Should we call it joy? Just remember that. Should we call it joy? So from this drawing, she built a little maquette to show me what this was going to look like. It was about that size. I'm not that clever. I said, Pipilotti, how is this going to really work? She said, okay, I'll build you a bigger maquette. So she rented a studio. This maquette is 1/3 size, so you have to multiply it 27 times to get to the size of our atrium, but you can actually stand in it. As we were there, we could begin to understand what it would feel like. She did a lighting plan, and you can see that troublesome column where the red is, and she had to figure out and ultimately invent with a lighting designer a new way of using digitalized imagery so that you could X out all the pixels that would hit that column, so the column remains a column, and then backfill behind it. Here, the bird's nest, this notion of bee's nest and bird's nest, this organic sense of transforming this austere space into something about nature. Here's the bird's nest in the maquette. Here's the actual one-to-one scaling of one of those nests, and one of the interesting and unexpected things that happened, because you've got to fit a projector behind it. Projector is hidden behind it and has to be able to cast its light through it. It morphed into something much more breast-like, which, as you'll see, is not inappropriate given the nature of this work. Here's a kind of very precise diagram now of how this is going to look. The breast-like nest in the upper left corner, the images now being broadcast around the room, the column remaining unaffected by the imagery, and now in the center of the space, a round seating arrangement, more or less in the shape of an iris. So you sit now on this iris-like form, and it recalls the act of looking, but it also creates this space that breaks down the rigidity of the atrium and encourages people to act differently. This is the sort of final design she showed us before we said, okay, let's go spend a ton of money to try and make this happen. And this is her speaking.
The basic concept was not to try to destroy or try to be provocative to the architecture, but to melt in, as if I would kiss Taniguchi, more like or with my collaborators. The visitor come to the museum, so they bring their body to the museum as the biggest difference to the mass media coming to your living room. That you move your body, and then this kind of useless big room only made to enlighten the body in a way that people come in this room and they feel stretched. Yeah. So huge rooms always mean to honor the spirit in a way. It's like in church, you say it's the house of God, and as one of my biggest fights is to reconcile thinking and body. So it's a wish, pour your body out, that a title that is redirecting to the body of the visitors. People are welcome to move, to use this space as their own, and maybe even do stretching or rolling or singing. I'm always concerned how people in which situation, how comfortable or in which direction they watch and can move. And of course it's always a mixture between constraints and content wishes. It's better you see the video than the artist.
Now, can you imagine one of the great American male sculptors, say Richard Serra, who makes these monumental Corten steel forms, saying that he wanted to kiss Taniguchi? Think about it. Think about the different mindset, the different aesthetic spirit behind Pipilotti's approach to the museum. She wanted to embrace it. She wanted to ennoble the architecture. She wanted to caress it. She wanted to make a work of art that would be utterly transformative and joyous. I'll show you just a brief clip because it's so hard with a multi-channel video to really understand what's going on. A brief clip, it's silent, of what it's like now to be in that space. There are 3 walls and projections on each wall. And so what you're seeing here is an amalgam of all 3 of those projectors, as if you were looking at it in a straight line, but in fact, it's meant to be something that you circulate around and that you experience. You can never see the whole work at any one time. The actual work itself is 16 minutes long. It's on a loop, so it just keeps replaying itself over and over again. And at its center is this notion of regeneration and birth. It's this idea of nature without humans, but also a kind of paradise lost where humans regain their natural feelings. When we were working a little earlier doing the test setup, one of the technicians said, "So there's no sound with slide 44. I didn't know what slide 44 was. He said, "You know, the one with the redhead." And she's got, fantastically red hair. And then at every moment, the kind of moment in this is when these images dissolve into this kind of kaleidoscopic burst of color and saturated imagery. Now, I want to read a quote by Jerry Saltz, a very noted critic in New York, who was moved to say something that I've actually thought about a lot and realized that it's central to what is so remarkable about this work. Writing about Pour Your Body Out, he says, "It is one of the most seductively rebellious artistic gestures since Linda Benglis' notorious Art Forum ad in 1974. Linda Benglis was an earlier feminist artist. Benglis's action slapped a biased art world awake. Wrist's Pour Your Body Out suspends us in a primordial sea of liquids and performs a metaphysical sex change on the Museum of Modern Art. The atrium of this bastion of masculinism becomes a womb, and the museum itself a woman. In an abstract way, Wrist makes the institution ovulate." So I show you. So I've always wondered what that would be like. So now as but he actually got at something that I think is really deeply important. So you see here our minimalist gallery with the great Solowit white form on the floor, Donald Judd in the back, Robert Ryman on the walls. Again, and it is true, there's a kind of austere masculine dimension to so much of what modern art is about. And she upends that. She doesn't actually attack it. She's not interested in critiquing it. That's not her point. She's interested in just simply a different experience, one in which people can be subsumed by the pleasures of looking at a work of art, where they can go into our atrium and see this extraordinary panorama unfold around them as if they were in the act of the art making itself, and where they can actually start to behave differently. Just like Jim Lambie got those people to sit down on the floor in front of the Rodin, look what Pipilotti has got them to do in our atrium, to take their shoes off, to lie down on this bench. And what happens every day is you have mothers with their little children in strollers, you have elderly people, you have curators from the museum, you have young adults, you have older adults, you have foreigners, you have Americans, and they're sitting on the floor, they're on the bench, they're inside the circle, and they're all talking to each other and looking at a work of art. And it is that experience of breaking down the barriers between each of us, about making the work of art a transformative element in one's life, that grounds Pipilotti's act right back to the founding of the Museum of Modern Art. So let me draw to a quick close so I can take your questions. What is it then that I think is central to a museum? And I would take that to mean any museum, but especially a museum of modern art. One, it has to be a source of energy, a place of ideas, a locus of investigation and of experience. It has to burst out of its walls. The idea of the museum as sanctuary and repository, which is a wonderful and beautiful idea, is also an idea that in the 21st century we have to think about in a different way. If we want museums to survive and to thrive, they have to be central to the way we live. For them to be central to the way we live, they have to be able to engage people in unique sets of activities that are social in function, places where people come to be with other people. They have to be places that nonetheless can provide exquisite and extraordinary opportunities to look at great works of art. Wander around the Cleveland Museum in the renovated galleries, and it's exhilarating. It's exhilarating to see works of art exquisitely installed, perfectly lit, that animate the mind. Same thing when you look at this installation of Picasso sculptures. But it is this moment when everything breaks down, the order gives way to disorder, the structure of the museum gives way to the pleasures of people discovering each other, that I think is the ultimate experience of what a great art museum can provide. So let me just close on another one of my favorite Flickr slides. I found this one roaming around and I thought, nah, it can't be. I looked more closely, I say, yeah, it's the Museum of Modern Art. Two guys jumping for joy. I don't know how the guards let them do this, but that to me is a reflection of the pleasures and the importance that a museum can play in people's lives. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to take any questions you might have. I know there are microphones to my left and my right, and I'll start to the left.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for coming. Your enthusiasm for art is really contagious, and I'm looking forward to my next trip to New York City, so thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between art and health and well-being, and maybe the role that art can play in getting healthy and staying healthy.
Oh, it's a great question, and of course this is a perfect location for it, because I think certainly in the new building that I got to walk through, art is present, and I think present in a really thoughtful way, not just on the walls of the building, but in the landscaping of the buildings around. And I actually think healthy minds are healthy because they think, and they're open to ideas. And what art is really about is curiosity, back to that problem-solving issue. Art asks questions. And I think what artists have is a unique ability to make us look and think differently, and to slow us down sometimes, not speed us up, slow us down, and to create for us pleasures that are unanticipated and unexpected. And for me, at least, it's impossible to be whole without thinking and looking at art all the time. And I think sometimes we're not even aware of it. You don't actually have to say, oh, I'm going to look at art today. It's to be suffused with it, to wander through a corridor and see something you hadn't expected, and to stop and go, what is that strange poly-dimensional form hanging from the ceiling of Toby's new building? And to discover that it's an iceberg. But it's an iceberg like you've never seen before because you're looking up through it. But it's the unexpectedness of it that I think is central. So we're involved in lots of discussions about whether or not art plays a beneficial role in the school system. You know, if you teach art, will it help kids learn math? And you say, well, actually, it doesn't matter if it helps them learn math. Maybe they should learn about art so that they could be richer human beings, even if they can't count, which would be me. But what we've learned, and there are lots of studies to this effect, although all of them have their own flaws, is that what thinking about and looking at and even making art teaches you is how to do things differently. In other words, languages tend to be very formal in their structure, whether it's mathematical or verbal. Art is an informal language. And by becoming comfortable with that informal language, it allows us to solve problems, often in unexpected ways. And I do think there's a relationship.
You just kind of went into that direction. Can you tell me what MoMA's education department is doing to kind of create some substantive learning experiences for school kids in New York and those who come and visit?
No, it's a great question. I think that, clearly education is at the center of what our institutions do. We work extensively with both the public and the private school system in New York. But we actually look at it as a program that starts with young children before they've even gotten into school, and we have family programs for toddlers, all the way to adults who have long since graduated, that there's a continuum. And those programs range from art making, which is actually learning about how to reproduce something or how to make something, to art history, learning about the history of art, to a kind of art appreciation, learning how to talk about works of art. We have a variety of programs. My two favorite are a program that works with high school kids to learn how to be curators. They actually curate their own show at the Museum of Modern Art. They come from different schools. They're all inner city schools, some of the most disadvantaged schools in the city. And they work with our educators and curators for 3 months. And then they go back into their school and they actually select works of art, write the labels, frame them up, and hang them in the museum in an exhibition. The other program that I like, and it's really one of the great, I think, innovative programs that we do, and it's a little bit to that first question, is we work a lot with Alzheimer's patients and their families. Because art is, it turns out, looking at art is something that can actually get at least patients who are not in an advanced state engaged again, not only on their own with works of art, but engaged again with their families. Sorry.
Given your early interest in science, as you had aspirations to be a physician, what do you see as the commonality between artists and scientists?
Oh, great question. I have to confess, Toby gave you half the story of why I ended up in art history. The other half actually had to do with primate biology at 8:30 in the morning. And, that just, that was not me. Well, I think, and then this was really one of the reasons when Toby asked me if I would come out, and of course I was thrilled to do that, but for me the pleasure was to get a sneak peek, as it were, behind the scenes, to see really how some of the most extraordinarily talented physicians and surgeons can perform. And I do think there's a similarity. You learn certain things. Artists learn how to do certain things. They learn how to do them over and over again. Toby said, yeah, it's easy after 10,000 times. Well, it's the same thing with an artist. You experiment, and then you get it down so you can do it perfectly. But you also have to deal with the unexpected problem. The surgery that doesn't go exactly the way it was supposed to go. The thinking very quickly, okay, if that's not working, what will? And I think there isn't as big a divide, left brain, right brain, as people like to think. I remember I was very lucky as a young curator to work with Dr. Sackler. Arthur M. Sackler was early in his life a physician, scientist, and then, of course, great patron of the arts. And he really believed that these left side, right side, they're fused together. There is no difference. And I think to a certain degree he's right, because it's all about using your imagination and then training yourself to realize what your imagination allows to happen.
I want to thank you. You have brought us art, you have brought us experience, and you have given us joy. Thank you for creating a museum here for us. We appreciate it. And I'd like to invite all of you to our next speaker, who is going to be Tom Brokaw, who will be here on February 12th. And thank you very much for coming out on a very snowy evening, but I think you will all agree it was well worth the effort. Thank you again.